Good evening to everyone who's joining us from Asia. Good morning to everyone who's joining us from Europe and Africa. Welcome to our webinar about China and Africa and COVID-19. Obviously, this is a topic that everyone has been talking about, and the only thing that most people have been talking about. For almost 2 decades of steadily rising trade, investment engagement, and China-Africa relations are now at a critical inflection point. But the outbreak has revealed key weaknesses in the relationship, and now there's a gaping chasm, which we'll talk about, between African civil society and China. But at the same time, China's ties with the continent are deepening, and they're indispensable, particularly in the fight to contain the ongoing pandemic. So today we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and how they reconcile with each other, and particularly about the future of what the China-Africa relationship might possibly look like as well. With Hannah Ryder. She's the CEO of Development Reimagined, which is a pioneering international development consultancy and the first Kenyan wholly foreign-owned enterprise in Beijing. Their niche is in providing strategic advice and practical support to African, Chinese, and international stakeholders on issues about Belt and Road, Africa's growth markets, green growth, and China's foreign aid. Hannah previously when I met Hannah, actually, she was at the UN. She has had a number of incredible diplomatic and advisory roles, and she's an economist by training, and she's commonly on global media like Bloomberg, FT, Quartz, etc. So we're very excited to have Hannah. Second, we have HongXiang Huang, who graduated from the Journalism School of Fudan and has an MPA in development practice from Columbia University. He's the founder of China House, which he started in 2014, looking to integrate China into global sustainable development through global citizen education and youth engagement. He was also featured, I think, at least my first kind of exposure to him was he was in the Oscar shortlisted film, The Ivory Game, as the primary ivory trade investigator, and was endorsed by Dr. Jane Goodall as a hero, since they've been on a number of influential TV programs together. And he is currently calling in from Shanghai. Sorry, Hannah is currently in Beijing as well, so welcome. And then Eric, you guys have heard his voice many times on the China-Africa Project podcast. He's a journalist with more than 30 years of experience with leading organizations like CNN, France 24, BBC World Service. So he's got the professional setup with the mic and everything today. He's fluent in both French and Mandarin. I actually didn't know the French part. And as you guys know, he is the founder of the Africa-China Project and the co-host of the podcast as well, which many of you listen to. I just also wanted to quickly plug that for those of you who are interested in following the issues that we're going to be talking about on a daily basis and really follow like the most relevant news, and you're going to want to subscribe to the China Africa Project's daily email newsletter. It's incredible, really comprehensive. It's read by top officials at the UN, the US government, the World Bank, etc. All these people. It's really the only comprehensive daily digest of what's going on in China-Africa relations available, and it's absolutely great. And just for attendees of today's event, China Africa Project is offering a 33% discount, and shortly I will send the link, the promo code.
Thank you for the plug.
You're welcome. I love it. So definitely want to promote that as well. So without further ado, we're going to move into a lot of these really important questions that affect a lot of us, those of us living both in China and across the African continent. So Hannah and Eric, this question is for both of you. Is China using the coronavirus crisis to gain influence in African countries more so than the Europe or the US? And has this come through in the form of aid? Either one of you can start.
Hannah, go ahead first.
Okay. Well,
This is a really good question. And thank you so much, Steph, for inviting me to be part of this important discussion, important panel. This question, influence and COVID-19, I think certainly China has got a head start. And I don't mean that lightly, in the sense of course, China's had COVID-19 first before anybody else. And so many of the experiences that China's going through are the first ones, and everyone else is having to deal with it later. And I think part of that is that's also the case with regards to aid and support. So we have seen, in particular, Jack Ma Foundation and Alibaba working together with Ethiopian Airlines to provide lots of medical equipment. Our firm has valued that equipment and goods at around between 82 and 228 million US dollars worth of equipment to 54 African countries. And then more recently, we've seen the deployment of Chinese medical teams to 7 countries now, although 2 of those there's 2 countries, Algeria and Nigeria, which have had 2 sets of teams go through. But really, at the same time, what we've seen from the international community is, in particular, the IMF and World Bank have been quite active, especially around issues around debt relief. So there is some movement, but part of the issue is that many of the international donors, typical international donors, whether it's the US or the UK, are very much taken up with dealing with the domestic crisis that they have at the moment. And as they come out of that, they will also start to focus elsewhere. So I think it's partly that, but at the same time, what we're seeing is a much expanded response from China, which is exactly the right thing. This is a health crisis. It is also an economic crisis, and we have to look at it in both ways. So it is absolutely right for all international partners to be supporting African countries in particular to deal with the issues, but they need to look at it both as a health crisis and an economic one. And I think we'll discuss those points going forward.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Hannah said, I always agree with, and I totally agree with that. But I think there's a tendency oftentimes when we talk about influence and geopolitics and China in particular, that brings up the US. We want to look at it in these very binary terms. Is China trying to vie for influence in Africa? Absolutely. That is what foreign policies are about. The Chinese are doing it, the Americans are doing it, French are doing it, and they're not doing it just in Africa, they're doing it everywhere. So Africa is one theater that they're operating in, but it's not as simple as that. When we look at how the COVID aid is being delivered in Africa by the Chinese, and again, the word Chinese starts to break down here. There's some research that comes out that says 50% of the aid is being done by private sector, by businesses, local business associations, communities. About 22% is being done by philanthropies like Jack Ma. Only 17% of the actual COVID-19 aid going from China to Africa is from the government. So all of a sudden, when we start looking into the picture, it becomes a lot more complex. China's in a unique position compared to, say, Europeans or Americans, because they have a large migrant population, an established business community. There is a diaspora that's there, and they're stepping up. But again, that starts to complicate the narrative a little bit. What's interesting is if you look at the Twitter feeds of the various Chinese embassies and diplomats, they are coordinating quite a bit of this aid, even if it's coming from associations, individuals, and whatnot. So they're using the aid, regardless of where it comes from, for public diplomacy, which is that influence piece, but they're not actually paying for it or owning the whole process, as we've seen, for example, in Nigeria, where the medical team mission has just gone completely haywire. And in that case, the Chinese government said, no, that was CCE's gig, that wasn't us. And they have that plausible deniability. So again, with so much, and it's a good way for us to start our conversation on China-Africa, is that it is both and at the same time. And there's not usually a binary yes or no answer. And you'll always get this complex kind of, well, yes, maybe both and.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's incredibly important to remember throughout all of this conversation that we have 3 voices, and we're lucky that they're quite diverse voices in that their background and their their expertise, but there's so many different aspects of the China-Africa relationship, and it's so easy to be reductionist in our conversations around it. So, you know, as we talked about fiascos and things that have not gone well within COVID, and, you know, all of us have heard about what happened in Guangzhou and kind of the escalating and retaliatory measures across all the different parties involved. And HongXiang, you have been so vocal in writing about the view of Chinese as racists. You know, can you share a little bit more about that? Is this true? And how do you think we can move more away from this kind of, you know, racism, this breaking apart of the relationship and move more toward collaboration?
Sure. So this year we actually witnessed I would say two quite big incidents regarding like Africans in China. One is definitely about Guangzhou. The other is about the permanent residency of foreigners in China, which was also heavily directed to the topic of like Africans in China as well. So, and in the piece I wrote for the China Africa project, so essentially what I was saying is that I know right now there are some people trying to say like, no, in China there are no racism, like there's no discrimination to other people and so on. But well, at least according to my personal experience, they are racist in China. And maybe because I'm coming from a very small place in China, like some of my my close relatives that are actually quite nice people in many ways, they are actually quite racist in many other ways at the same time. So what I was trying to say is that yes, definitely they are racist in China, just like they are racist in every country. But in China, there are also a lot of people who are not racist and are against that racism as well. So when the Guangzhou situation happened, because China House, we're involved with a lot of like young Chinese people, we do a lot of educational program. So when the Guangzhou incident happened, actually the first one who told me about that was actually my student who is still in high school in Shanghai. So she can see all those news on Weibo, and she was very angry because she had been to Kenya and she met some friends there as well. So she was angry. She tried to fight those Chinese racists on the internet. They argue against each other and so on and so on. So my point is that I think like in China, because of many historical reasons and also it's a homogeneous society and so on, there are many races and there are many people who may not even know the concept of racism at all. They may be racist while not knowing this is an issue at all. But with a lot of young people coming up, with a lot of young people growing up to have more global perspective and so on, it's slowly changing. And I can definitely feel if there are more people-to-people exchange, then the situation would change. Because recently we have been doing quite a lot of like small projects like between China and Africa. For example, we organized some webinar to organize some Chinese doctors to talk to like local NGOs in Kenya, in South Africa about how to prevent COVID-19. We're helping a Kenya social enterprise to sell their handicraft to China. We are working on a competition called PBIC that is essentially Chinese students trying to come up some idea that can help like people in Africa under COVID and so on. And we can feel that through this kind of small exchange, they actually get to meet each other and talk to each other, even sometimes just online and having this kind of like real personal exchange. And I think that helps a lot because what happened right now is that there are many races in China that they may not even have actually talked to African people at all. And once they have met some people, they have talked to real people, and a lot of them, they are changing already. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, so 2 points there, right? Number one, I have been so impressed in general at the response of the youth towards COVID, and the you know, the outcry and just the types of responses, innovation that they really come up with in order to answer that. And secondly, I read an interesting statistic this morning that I didn't know and I haven't confirmed yet, but that China has one of the lowest immigration populations in the world at 0.7%. I mean, assume also like they're so large that also makes sense, right? But exposure is such a instrument. Sorry, go ahead, Hannah.
Small in absolute numbers too. It's less than 1 million people.
Yeah.
Basically, all across the world. So that's not just Africans.
Yeah, and I can. Do you know what the percentage of Africans of the?
We don't.
Okay.
Yeah, figures aren't released by the government.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, but I think the question about exposure is so important in furthering empathy and understanding between diverse cultures as well. Hannah and Eric, do you guys?
Just one key thing in the discussion about racism in China, particularly coming from the African side, as someone who's kind of spending a lot of time on the social media and in the media, and the narrative has also been picked up in the US and Europe as well, that China is racist. And there's not a distinction made between the Chinese state and the Chinese society. Now, this is a subtle, we're getting into the weeds here a little bit, but there are issues that are ongoing with Chinese civil society and racism, and that's what HongXiang is talking about, and that's what we're seeing fill a lot of the social media videos that are angering people, can't get into restaurants. Hannah, you posted, a Beijing restaurant, a UN official couldn't get in, there are no foreigners allowed into a Beijing restaurant. All of that is happening on the civil society side. What's been interesting is in the aftermath of what happened in Guangzhou, and I don't say this in any way to defend Guangdong or Guangzhou, but they have been making quite a bit of efforts to actually remediate some of the situation. There was an acknowledgement that there was a problem, and public policy-wise, institutional racism, in that sense, that's a technicality, but the government is actually saying, no, our policies are not discriminatory. Again, this is hard to kind of split the hair on this in terms of how people feel, but it is important to recognize what is state-sanctioned discrimination and racism and what's actually the racism that we're seeing in social media.
Yeah, so I think, let me also add to that, and as somebody that has been working as an African that's been living and working in China for 5 years now. The fact is, yes, of course, there's a very diverse society in terms of perspectives. That's important to realize, just like any other society, and there are people who are racist. It's very difficult to get racism out of any society. I'm not sure that there is one that doesn't have that. At the same time, part of the issue, and I think this is a point that there's a question that's been raised about this, so which is why it's useful to really focus on it. Part of the issue is that the status of Africans in China is fundamentally not very different to the status of Africans in many other countries. And COVID-19, as well as bringing out the really, the good nature of people, is also bringing out the really poor nature of people. And Africans across the world are being treated very badly in many societies. So it's really important, and I think what the diplomats in China did, the African diplomats in China did, was very, very helpful, very important that they took responsibility too. There was an unprecedented letter from the African ambassadors to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There was an apology from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There was real action taken to address it. And so I think that we have to bear that in mind. Part of the challenge is also that the status of Africans, especially in Guangzhou, was very much traders who are taking goods from China to Africa. And that's part of this overall economic relationship with China at the moment, which is very much driven around and very much a trade deficit relationship. What we need to see is a shift from both the Chinese and African side in not just having a political relationship, but also an economic relationship, which is mutually beneficial, and that you have trade relations. You have people who are also interested in being able to bring African goods into China. Part of that will make a big difference, because you will have Africans who are invested much more in China, and Chinese people who are invested also from the other side. So I think we also need to look at the broader shift in the relationship. It's not just about individual people and people-to-people relationships, but it needs to be on a much more equal footing. And Chinese people have benefited from going into Africa, have benefited from the fact that you've got fairly easy visa and migration policies in African countries because of other foreign investors being in African countries for a very, very long time. But we don't have the same case, we don't have the same thing from the Chinese side. China's visa policy is notoriously difficult. So I think these are things which also need to be addressed in the longer term, not just the short term, Guangzhou dealing with it, but we have to actually shift the relationship.
Great. I think since we're still kind of on this topic, I want to talk about, you guys have mentioned a little bit, the media, and what's interesting is in the beginning of the racism incident in Guangzhou, it wasn't being covered by a lot of the Chinese outlets. It was in social media, but it wasn't, officially covered. So this question kind of goes back to HongXiang about, have you seen, even after this, have you seen the mainstream Chinese perspective of Africa change within COVID? And what do you think is media's role in this?
Well, I don't think there are many changes that I have seen. And actually, let's be honest. Like, Africa is not really a very commonly not a very common topic on Chinese media at all. So what I have seen recently regarding Africa is usually two types of story. One is that the COVID situation is really difficult there, and really there are a lot of issues that are concerning. So that's one kind of like articles I have seen. The other kind of articles I have seen is that, the same narrative we have heard it many times in China, right? So China has helped Africa a lot, but now there's some African people that are turning to the West. So yeah, that's another kind of things that I have seen. And I also saw a comment there, like on the chat box, saying, okay, the issue is how to fix it. And that's exactly what I think is related to this question as well. I think right now the situation in China is that there's a lack of like global perspective and global citizenship education in China. In China, I would say the majority of Chinese people right now, they do not even know the concept of racism at all. So there are some very educated Chinese people. There are some Chinese people who have been abroad and so on and so on. But it's really a super small population in China. So we're talking about apology, right? I believe a lot of the people, Chinese people, actually involved in the situation, they may not even know they should do an apology at all. So what I would feel like right now in China, what we need is that we need the media to help more Chinese people understand more about this kind of more global concept, this kind of like global perspective, global knowledge, and so on. What is racism? How is the situation of China in Africa? Like, what is the real situation of Africa? Like, Africa is not just one country, there's many countries, it's diverse as well. And there are all kind of different people everywhere. And how do people, and even this time, like, I know internationally, many people are talking about the issue of Guangzhou, but in China, I don't believe many people even know about it. So what I would say is that in China, there need to be more media and more kind of like education or promotion to help more Chinese people, especially the young Chinese people who still have the chance to evolve, to understand more about the global situation and how the world is seeing China and the issues in China. And I think that's something that could really help a lot, but it can only change things in a more longer term. That's my personal view.
Yeah. And let me add to that, because I agree very much that it's also about, it's about shifting the narrative, it's about shifting the economic relationship. And the challenge is, however, that while the government does have a very clear position with regards to racism, and also has a very kind of clear position with regards to African countries, we're brothers, sisters, all of this sort of thing. The perspective about Africa is very much an old perspective. It is not one which is grounded in, the whole narrative around Africa rising is absolutely not in China at the moment. People, very much know very little about African countries. And can't differentiate between, Central African Republic or South Sudan or Kenya or Ethiopia or Rwanda. It's extremely, there is so much more education and understanding to be done. But part of that is also about helping to understand the growth story in African countries. So not just the really difficult ones. And this is where it's really challenging for COVID-19 responses, because it's exactly the same kinds of responses as we've had for decades. It's medical teams going out, it's donations. Is that exactly what is going to help in the long term? There also needs to be more.
That's such an interesting perspective to me, that like, while there's obviously been a lot of conversation and relatively more coverage about things like donations, especially with what Jack Ma's done, everything like that, that's opposite of what we're looking for in terms of this story about the growth and things like that. And it was
and fundamentally what we want, what African economies want, is that we want to have a relationship with the Chinese economy and people in the Chinese economy where we also have Chinese factories, for example, investing in African countries, moving along with this manufacturing agenda and so on. So we need Chinese investors to be looking at African countries. We need them to be looking at them as a really interesting investment proposition. But that's not necessarily going to happen if all we do is think about Africans as in need.
Right. And then I also think it's interesting that I was actually pitching to a couple. So I work in the tech space for listeners who don't know me. I was pitching a story actually about Ghana's M-Pharma, which is a great kind of pharmaceutical supply chain health tech startup in Africa that has signed a multi-million-dollar deal with Sancher, which is a medical production company. And they're not just, it's not just they're buying, products from Sancher. They've set up, a whole training program with lab technicians, all of these things. And I was pitching the story to a couple of Chinese outlets, and they seemed completely disinterested, right? Even though, it was a story about China-Africa growth, they said this is just not relevant, so I do think that there's a lot of opportunity and more outlets and places to talk about this narrative. Kind of continuing on the theme of economic development, but switching gears a little bit, can we talk a bit more about Chinese debt? So Hannah, do you think China will remain the preferred lender for African countries if it agrees to delay the debt repayments? Let's delve a little bit into that.
Okay, should we start with some statistics first?
Yeah, I'm sure you have them on hand, so yeah.
We have to start with numbers, like what is the reality? So yes, more recently, many countries have gone to China to get to be able to get new loans. However, we have to remember that around 35, there have been studies from Jubilee Debt Campaign in particular, who looked at the debt position for 48 African countries. They found that the majority of debt is to private sector and to multilaterals. But then when you look at the bilateral donors, for example, US, UK, Germany, or France, etc. Now, who a lot of them do put money into the multilaterals, which China doesn't to the same degree, then China is the largest lender out of those. So, which means overall, in the whole pot, China is about 20% of overall debt, of external debt.
And that's heavily weighted in certain countries. So it's not even across the continent.
Absolutely. So we need to remember that. However, what is clear is that that has happened through a process of not just China, not just African countries, but also the limitations on countries such as the US and Europe in terms of their finance, what they want to put their investment into, and whether they want to raise loans directly. They often don't have instruments to do that. They just use the multilaterals for that. And it's also happened because China has been able to make available those loans to countries, and they will request it directly, or Chinese companies will bid, and then they'll have an arrangement, etc. Will it be the preferred lender after COVID-19? It will depend on whether, from the Chinese side, whether there remains an interest in continuing to invest abroad. And I think that very much depends on the Chinese domestic economy and what direction that will take, and whether recovery will really just be focused about recovering internally and not necessarily investing abroad to the same degree. My feeling is that's not going to happen. My feeling is that actually Chinese, and HongXiang can also add to this, and Eric too, my feeling is that there will actually potentially be a bigger drive, and in particular, not to loans necessarily, but to investment, and to investing in, for example, new factories, or buying up and expanding, scaling up other factories, because growth within China will be very constrained for a very long time. So I think that there will be that opportunity for African countries to not just now get loans from China, but also to move to get more investment from China, which is actually going to be which, if managed correctly, is going to be in the continent's interest. We do need foreign direct investment. We need support and growth in African economies. And if that can be bolstered after COVID-19, that would be great.
So in my newsletter, and Hannah gets it every day, and I've been kind of dark and grim in the past couple weeks on this because, and today's newsletter, in fact, is entitled "It's Not Fair." And the president of the AFDB did an interview with Aubrey Ruby this week where he said, listen, this wasn't our doing. We were actually managing our economies quite well. We were in many cases managing debt levels quite well. We were doing everything right, and all of a sudden COVID comes. Our credit ratings are being downgraded, our currencies are being devalued, the cost of borrowing is going up, and we're going to have to now allocate, Hannah, what is it, $38 billion towards public health? And to this day, we still don't have a debt relief deal. Don't pay attention to the G20 stuff, because the G20 is talking about $20 billion. And the G20 is actually boxing in countries like Kenya to say, if you take our debt relief money, you can't then go and get concessional loans or raise money. Now, for a country like Kenya, that's running a massive budget deficit right now because it simply cannot afford to pay for both the interest payments and the public health requirements, it's saying, well, what do? We're stuck. So go back to, it's not fair. So at the same time here, when we look at what the Chinese are going to do, and there's this new thing which I really recommend everybody look into, it's called the Africa Private Creditors Working Group. APCWG. Those guys represent $9 trillion of the asset managers, the Eurobond holders, and all the funds. They have come out very, very clearly and said, we are not going to do blanket debt forgiveness in Africa. The Chinese have come out and said, we're not going to do blanket debt forgiveness in Africa. We're going to work one by one. And the question that I have is that every single day, like the time since we've started this conversation, hundreds of millions of dollars of interest are accruing on that debt. And we are 2 months into this crisis now, and there's not been a deal. And I'm becoming increasingly more convinced that the Chinese are going to look out for their interests, which is important because Chinese taxpayers like HongXiang have rights too. The private creditors are going to look out for their interests because they have a fiduciary interest to their shareholders to make sure that they are looked after. And at the end of the day, I'll be less diplomatic than Hannah, who's a professional diplomat. Africa is going to get screwed. At the end of the day, Moody's came out and said, even if there is a credit, even if there is a debt relief plan, we're still probably going to downgrade your credit and force the cost of borrowing up. It's now double-digit cost interest rates for South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, 38% rates on Zambia. I mean, the rates are going to skyrocket. Will China be the preferred lender? I think there's going to be a very bitter aftertaste in Beijing about lending a lot of money to Africa once this is over. I think the days of $6–7 billion railways in places like Kenya are gone. I agree with Hannah 100% that on the private and corporate side, Transcend's going to use this as an opportunity. We saw a big cement deal go down this week that's been in the works. We're going to see the private sector do a lot of activity. This is an opportunity to grow. Maybe Star Times is going to acquire Canal Plus or DSTV. But on the state-backed side, you know, maybe not. But I think the appetite for big, risky, low return projects may actually go away. And that's going to make it hard for Africa to get the power, the infrastructure, and all the things that they need.
HongXiang, do you want to come in? Because I want to even add some more to that. I don't want to hog.
No, go ahead, Hannah, go.
Well, see, the thing is, I think I agree with Eric that there are some really major issues, and I will be having an article which is coming out a bit later, hopefully this week or early next week, which talks about a solution to all of this, which is much more long term. Now, we have to remember that China's one by one, we will negotiate with you approach, and what the private sector are saying is not unusual. Even the IMF is saying we're going to do one by one. And that, of course, puts every single debtor into a very, very difficult position, because they're having to negotiate one by one with every single loan partner. And they're in a very, there is an opportunity for African countries to get together, for example, to set the terms of what they want. Of course, the UN Economic Commission for Africa have been trying to manage that process. African Union have also been trying to do that. But what they haven't done is actually say exactly what terms they want. So I think there's a shift in the architecture, and COVID-19 is making us, is an opportunity to really rethink how the debt architecture works, and how it is problematic, especially for countries that are growing, because they're penalized for having high debt, which they need high debt in order to grow. It's fundamentally, some of these projects, Eric, that you mentioned, for instance, around Kenya's SGR, well, it's really important to have right now. All those problems that we're facing at the moment at the border with Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda. Imagine if the train was actually going through right now. We would not be having to deal with those issues right now. And that would actually be a very, very productive investment in a COVID-19 context. So we need to rethink some of this. We can't just kind of just accept this overall narrative that everything is now, all negative. Actually, if you look at the IMF growth forecasts, Africa as a whole is going to be growing less. It will have its overall first recession since last 25 years. However, if you look at the countries where there will be growth, look at that top 10. Before COVID-19, we were saying 6 out of 10 of the fastest growing countries will be in Africa, in the world. Now it's going to be 8 out of 10. If there's any growth in the world economy, it's in Africa. So we should be really paying attention, and we should be encouraging China, private investors to be thinking about that, and to be thinking about that very, very seriously. It is not a negative growth proposition. It's a positive growth proposition for them to invest and to give more loans and to be protecting the existing debt. It's about protecting their own investment.
Eric, do you want to say something?
No. I could talk for 4 hours on this. So, and that's why I have a podcast. So we have time is limited. So,
okay, I'm actually gonna bring this conversation a little bit back to HongXiang, because for me, right, I'm lucky because I work for a fintech, and so a lot of this conversation about debt and things like that I can follow well enough, right? But talking about something like repositioning a country's debt architecture is extremely complex, extremely high level, and there seems to be a lot of different conversations going on when we're saying youth need to be more involved, youth are going to be the future of this relationship, but like youth have no say in any of the things that we just talked about, right? So there's a lot of young Africans who are listening to this conversation right now, and hopefully will be spread as well. But HongXiang, with these kinds of like economic and geopolitical conversations, how do you think youth can get more involved and actually feel like they have an impact on what's going on?
Well, the situation is that, as I said before, I think now the situation is that these topics, although some topics are talked over and over again internationally, like Africa Rising and so on, but those are not really topics and knowledge that are well spread among, at least, I don't know about youth in other countries, but at least for youth in China, not many youth have even heard about them at all. Even the youth who are maybe studying in very top universities, or even the youth who are even studying in international high school that are going to study abroad in future and so on. So I would say the first step is really just to spread more of this kind of knowledge and discussion to them, for them to be even informed. Because over the past few years, I can feel a lot. Sometimes we will see some Chinese youth who are involved in this kind of topic by some quite random situation. For example, we have a student, like his family is doing real estate, And as Hannah pointed out before, like the situation in China is not that great. So their family business is looking to explore the opportunity to go overseas. And then he does a research with us to study real estate development in Africa to understand the situation. And then he realized a lot of the things in Africa is not what he had heard before at all. And we also have some very young Chinese students. They grow up in a narrative that China and Africa were good friends. China has been helping Africa a lot, and African people really appreciate Chinese brothers and so on. And then in an international like student conference, she heard some people saying, "No, you Chinese people are bad people in Africa. You are colonizing Africa." And she was very surprised. She had never heard about this before. And then she later on took a research trip to Ethiopia to try to talk to the local Chinese people to understand what's going on, to talk to the local journalists, to talk to the local NGO people and so on. And that totally changed her perception as well. And in future, she's planning to study more in this area. And all these young people, I would say maybe at this moment, they're not really involved, but they would be slowly, because nowadays in a lot of like Chinese companies, especially the Chinese companies leaders that are sent abroad, especially in Africa and so on, a lot of the time they're actually quite young actually. They're not really old people, because the old Chinese people, they don't want to go there. So a lot of time they are the young Chinese people. And also we can see a lot of young Chinese people getting into international organizations and media and so on and so on. So slowly and slowly, I would say the young people, they would have some say in this geopolitical topic and global economic topic and so on.
Great. I'm happy to hear that there's like realism, optimism. There's like a lot of good things going on. But yeah, I think I've actually been reached out by a couple of Chinese universities who have been asking about lectures around the China-Africa relationship or China's development in Africa. And I think being, even starting to expose students at that college level age is super important. And it's exciting to hear that there's, young people who are interested, who have, eventually will have say in their family businesses and things like that. And hopefully, there's a different narrative going on.
Steph, can I just also add to that? I mean, we have a lot of, in my firm, we also bring in a lot of interns and so on who are very young often and very, very enthusiastic and able to contribute in some way. And of course, they're also going to many other organizations as well. I think one area beyond that is, and beyond going into different organizations, is also just holding governments accountable. And I think, especially in African countries, trying to get an understanding from governments about where is your China relationship going is also a really important role of the youth. And I think that has come through, especially with, as the Africans in Guangzhou gives an understanding of that power, in a way, to hold African governments accountable for that.
Yeah, I mean, Africa is the youngest continent in the world, right? There are so many, and I think as of recent, it's been really interesting to see a lot of my friends across the continent start to get involved in politics in different aspects, whereas I think maybe generations before they wouldn't have been interested in such a thing, which is great. Awesome. So time flies when you're having fervent conversation. So we're coming up to just 15 minutes left. I'm going to ask one last question, and we have a couple of Q&A questions waiting for us. Just want to encourage all of the attendees to submit your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of Zoom. So, I mean, the last question is a bit general. You guys can kind of decide how you want to take it. But, post-COVID, post all of these things, whenever that will be, right? That's kind of preface, like, how do you define when post-COVID is and how is it defined? What do you think the China-Africa relationship will look like? Let's start with Eric.
Okay. I think we're at an inflection point right now. And I think COVID is both revealing, it's like an X-ray machine that kind of shows things that we didn't see before. And at the same time, it's speeding up processes that were already underway. So one thing that was already underway is I think the economic relationship between China and Africa has been in decline and will continue to decline. And the reason why is, and it's not any kind of conspiracy or anything, it's just that when China first went to Africa, in the mid 2000s, it didn't have as many places to go to buy the timber, mineral, the oil, and the things like that. What we're seeing now is over the past 15 years, the Belt and Road has come, trade with the Americas has gone up, it's buying more oil from the Mideast and the Gulf. It's diversifying its sourcing of these raw materials. And this is going to force a change that I think is going to put a lot of pressure on African stakeholders, because for hundreds and hundreds of years, African countries have defined their value and their place in the world in economic terms, because that's the way that the Europeans and really that the West has for many years has framed it. Now what we're seeing is that I think Africa is going to become politically more important to China. And we just saw that this week with Xi Jinping's speech to the World Health Organization, where he focused so much attention on Africa. It's going to be an increased role in the United Nations. It's going to be used as a block of votes against the United States. It's going to be about Huawei pushing back on the United States, 17 countries signing a letter to support Xinjiang, China's position in Xinjiang, the Ugandan government supporting China's role in Hong Kong and the way they're handling the protests there. The point, though, is that this is going to evolve, I think, into a more complex relationship and less the binary, we're going to buy stuff and sell stuff. And I think that's going to present all sorts of new challenges for Africans to better understand China. So we've talked so much about the Chinese kind of understanding of Africa. It shocks me to this day to see the low levels of understanding and knowledge. That's just what HongXiang's talking about across in Africa. And I have to say also in where I come from in the US, it's the same issue. So this is not uniquely an African issue per se, but increasing knowledge of China is going to be really important as this relationship changes. I think economically, the Chinese are going to lose some interest, particularly on the state level in Africa, I think because they're going to go to other parts of the world. And they're also at the same time, they're doing a lot of M&A activity in Europe and in other parts where I think they can see bigger returns than what they can get in Africa. We are also at an inflection point on the civil society side. And this is something we've been covering a lot in our podcast. And we interviewed Wodamaya last week and Ma Tianjie as well. People are bitter and pissed off, and there still has not been an apology to African people. The Chinese government, as Hannah pointed out, apologized to the diplomats. There's been issues of regret to the African Union, but there has never been the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi or Xi Jinping himself saying, we are very sorry for what happened. And one of the things that you see in the frustration coming from Africans is that lack of an apology, that lack of contrition. And the Chinese are moving away from, trying to engage civil society more and moving back to the state-to-state kind of engagement where they're happier. First of all, governments, for the most part, they don't do this kind of engagement very well. Not just China, but no government really can do it. 55 countries, thousands of cultures, all fragmented by social media. How are you going to engage civil society on a continent that large, that diverse? So I think we're at a chasm on the civil society side, I think economically and also political militarily. So we're at a very important junction, I think, in this relationship.
I see HongXiang doing a lot of nodding, so you want to go next?
Okay, so I totally agree with Eric, and I saw a lot of pessimistic sign actually over the past few months. So there are a lot of although before not many Chinese people saw the African rising side of the story, but there was a growing interest of Chinese business people going to Africa to do business. But recently, because of COVID, a lot of the Chinese business people, they are quite suffering in Africa. We can see that a lot of that from our social media sites and so on, especially the Chinese who are doing restaurants, tourism and so on. And recently there was a good trend of Chinese people being interested and willing to go to Africa as tourists, and also Chinese students going there to explore. Every year we took a lot of Chinese students to Africa to learn what's going on and so on. But because of COVID, Chinese people are going to be very scared and be afraid of going to Africa. There's a somehow feeling inside China right now that the real bad situation hasn't come yet, when we're talking about Africa. So really we don't know when people have this confidence back to go back there. And before we already lack communication and understanding of each side. And now if we even have less chance of Chinese people actually going to Africa, to see Africa, to meet African people, I'm afraid there will be a growing communication gap, even larger than before. But also, as Eric said, I can see there's some kind of opportunity coming out as well, because Chinese government, let's be honest, Chinese government is doing quite terrible this time regarding this diplomacy and PR and so on. So they may be more and more, like the people in China may be more and more realizing there need to be more people to people exchange, more real civil society engagement and so on. And that may somehow bring some hope to this Africa-China relationship. Because as Eric said, like government can never do this really great. Like there need to be more like civil society engagement. And maybe because of the disastrous situation, more people will realize, okay, now we really need to push for more Chinese civil society actors to interact with African civil society actors. And that may bring some good change in future. That's how I feel.
Great. And Hannah?
I'm glad that HongXiang went to the positive too, because I'm definitely not as concerned. Well, I'm concerned about the future, but I'm not negative about it. You know, my firm, we started tracking Africa's COVID-19 response quite early on. And we have found, for instance, that 69% of African governments started social distancing measures even before 10 cases were detected in their countries. That is a serious record. And it shows the seriousness with which African governments are taking COVID-19, despite the challenges of poverty. You know, imagine having to deal with COVID-19 when China was, you know, back in the 1970s. Yeah. This is the challenge that they're having to deal with. And I think the more that Chinese people understand that African citizens, African governments are working really hard to deal with COVID-19 and to try, despite the odds, to have that growth and to find those spots of growth, the better. And I think if that is understood across China, as opposed to this old narrative around, you know, Africa needs our help, these, you know, and it's a narrative that's been there since the 1950s. If people understand that, and I hope we can play a role in doing that, then the potential for not just loans, but also for more investment from Chinese people and companies into African countries. Hopefully, if people also see that, for example, Mauritius is already a post-COVID-19 environment. Now, of course, how is it going to deal with the tourism? But that's your first tourist destination, not Europe. In Mauritius, go there first. So these are the sorts of things which we need to introduce into the discussion and to introduce into the Chinese media to be well understood for that relationship to become, and I really think we need to work very hard, not just on the Chinese side, but also on the African side, to be much more proactive with the relationship. I hope COVID-19 has shown us that African governments can be proactive, not just with regards to the Chinese issues in Guangzhou, but also with regards to their own domestic challenges and the domestic threat of COVID-19. I am positive that that kind of proactivity will also move through into the future, and in terms of grabbing a hold of the Chinese relationship and trying to make it work for Africa's future. So yeah, that's where I am, but I am a glass half full person, but that's why we want to reimagine development. That's our point.
Yeah, and to your point, Hannah, too, is that one of the reasons why African countries like Nigeria have done so well is because they are extraordinarily experienced in dealing with infectious diseases, whether it's Lassa fever, whether it's Ebola, whether it's all these. And so rather than the Chinese kind of saying, we're going to send you help, instead, maybe the Chinese could do a better job in saying, what can we learn from you? Because one of the reasons that people, that again, as Hannah pointed out rightly, that we haven't seen necessarily the spread of the infection the same way we have in other parts of the world is because some of these habits are already deeply, deeply ingrained. Medical professionals are very trained in infectious and contagious diseases. This is something that's not new. I live in a tropical country here in Vietnam. We've had zero deaths and only a few hundred infections. And it's in part because they know how to deal with this. So it's not even about money. But again, I would like to see the Chinese express a little bit of humility rather than saying, we're constantly going to give to you, but what can we learn from you as well to kind of maintain that two-way dialogue?
And just to add,
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, and just to add to that, because I think that's is exactly what we're seeing right now. I think right now, like Chinese people in China really know very little about what's going on outside, like the real situation in the world. Like for most Chinese people, they may not even know like what Africa is like. There was one time I was with a very famous Chinese TV host in Kenya doing like a TV program, and he's one of those kind of like top elite in China already. And he was there on the stage saying, "Oh, Africa and China, these two countries have very good like friendship and so on." He repeated that 3 times. So while all the people are there like looking like, so to change all that situation, I believe what we need in China is more this kind of like global perspective education in China for more people to understand what's going on outside. Because all the kind of like arrogance, the kind of like looking like top down, those kind of like situation is based on a fact that they don't know much about what's going on outside. So we really need to change that.
So we're almost out of time, but I'm actually going to ask 2 of the questions that that were asked by our attendees. The first is actually for me and HongXiang, but what's the relationship between Chinese nationalism and the perception of treatment of foreigners in China, particularly Africans? So I'll let you answer that, HongXiang.
Well, I think that's a related question. Now there's very strong nationalism in China. Well, there's strong nationalism everywhere right now. But in China, there has been a really strong nationalism. And I would say one of the important reasons for that is the lack of understanding of the world. So, well, for China, like in history, we already have this view, right? Like we look at like ourselves as the center of the whole world and not being even interested in understand what's going on outside. And then later on, we started to get interested to learn at least like the situation in US, in Europe and Japan. But right now, still not many of us in China are interested in understand there's a bigger world than that, to understand what's going on outside. And that creates nationalism. And also that creates this kind of racial discrimination as well. Because if they know more about what's going on outside, the diversity, they know more about the history of what has happened in before, they know about those kind of white savior complex situation in Africa, or the history between like the West and Africa and so on, then a lot of this knowledge and behavior would change. So I would say they are all from the same root, which is the lack of understanding of the whole world.
I would also add to that and say it's not just lack of understanding, it's almost a purposeful desire to care in certain aspects. Like I find that a lot of my Chinese friends, when I moved to Kenya, I would tell them all these like amazing stories of my life here, and their question would always go back to, when are you going to move home to Shanghai? Right. And it was a lot about like, even if all of these other things are great, like China is still like middle country and, the center of the world. Why would you want to be anywhere else? And I almost feel like that kind of attitude bleeds into a like an intentional and really deep desire to understand other parts of the world. And I think what you said, HongXiang, about just increasing exposure will kind of pique people's curiosity and hopefully bring more of that in. And then the last question is anonymously asked, but is for Hannah. What strategies because this is exactly what Development Reimagined does, but what strategies do you think African countries or private sector, I think we can make that wide, should use to encourage Chinese companies to go to the continent again after COVID-19? It takes a lot of effort and time to convince the Chinese that Africa is a region where they can invest and make profits, but are there any more kind of like tangible things that we can do more short term to start spurring this reemergence of connection and trade?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first thing is to be intentional and to have a strategy, which a lot of African countries don't have right now. They have broad strategies about engagement of different partners. They have broad, for example, even their tourist boards typically will just advertise in the same sort of way in China as they would advertise in the US or Europe. And so that in itself just needs to change. There needs to be a real shift in thinking. China is a very, very different market. It is a very different type of partner, development partner. So we need to actually have a strategy full stop for engaging with China. We have to prioritize what we want to get out of that relationship, whether it's a country like Mauritius, of course, is tourism. A country like Kenya is both tourism, but it's also trade. And then very much have a very targeted plan for engagement. And in that sense, things like, not just doing trade shows, being very, very specific as to what kinds of trade shows you will do, what are the products that you're trying to market, but not only that, and this is where my firm does try to add value, is to also think about having a much long-term relationship. So not just thinking about, we're just going to be trying to export our raw commodities and raw materials to China, but actually think about how do we export finished products? How do we change the perceptions of African products and over African products in China in order to show that Africans can deliver what Chinese can deliver, or what the US or Europe can deliver, etc. These are things that need to be worked on and really need to be, there needs to be a real, very, very targeted, intentional strategy to make these happen. I hope, as I said, I see that the energy and the focus of African governments to deal with COVID-19 shows that it's possible. I really hope that they will use this opportunity to go at the China-Africa relationship with the gusto that they have done with COVID-19.
Wonderful. And then one last question for Eric, because one of our attendees, Clifford, has actually taken a link from your website, Eric. And because you're a journalist, because you have a huge social media following, Eric has almost over 1 million followers on LinkedIn, etc. There was obviously a lot of uproar from Africans in the wake of the bad treatment. And is that action, is using social media a way that we think that Africans can use to express their opinions about global issues affecting Africa more readily? Should African youth, the African citizens, etc., be doing that more often?
Yeah, I mean, the power of social media. The irony of this was that those social media posts that did force African governments to respond, and we're seeing this play out in Nigeria more than anywhere else, was actually built on the back of Chinese infrastructure. So there's this irony that's there at Africa. It's Transsion phones and it's Huawei networking gear, and that's what all this rage was kind of built upon. But it did show that the outrage, and I think one of the comments that we got earlier was the Chinese responded in part because of the outrage on social media, and some African stakeholders, some did. We do see a gap between the relationship between China and Africa's governing class and China and Africa's civil society. But certainly we're starting to see some movement, the pressure from social media onto the governing class and onto media as well. So one of the other parts of this is Premium Times in Nigeria, one of the leading newspapers there, the East African, the Daily Nation, Daily Maverick. These are some of the largest newspapers, all came out, and they're really responding to the outrage on social media as well. And this is really encouraging for the rise of independent media, which we all have to support in Africa, is everywhere for that matter. But they too came out very, very strong. And they said enough is enough. And that too was in response to the social media outrage. What's happened though, more, in the past few weeks though, is that there's a lot of the original outrage now has been corrupted by lots of videos that are 3 or 4 years old, lots of videos that are being misrepresented. Just, it's gotten all this toxic swill in social media. Some of it's legit, some of it's not. Makes it really very confusing to figure out what's what. So that's again why we need to go back to some of the journalism and support independent media to really better inform ourselves about the complexity. The last thing that I'll say, what I always try and leave any discussion on China-Africa with, is that if you hear that it's all bad, you're missing half the story. Similarly, if you hear that it's all good, you're missing half the story. The good and the bad in the China-Africa relationship, as with most relationships, sit side by side with one another. And I really want to encourage everybody to see the complexity and to embrace the complexity of this relationship. And again, it's very easy to kind of take one side and be partisan and saying China's this or Africa's that. Again, both are those labels are difficult to assign to both what is Africa, what is China, and places that are this big and this large. So I just hope that people will enjoy the complexity as much as I do, and I know that Hannah and HongXiang do as well, because that's the best way to understand this issue.
Great. I don't think I need to say any closing words because Eric, I think you did a great job of that. That's what I get for inviting a podcast host onto this webinar. But thank you everyone so much for joining us. I will be sending some show notes or some webinar notes as well as the contact and social media handles of all of our speakers in the follow-up email and the code and the sign up for Eric's newsletter as well. I hope everyone has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Thank you so much, panelists, for offering such vibrant and well-informed opinions. And I hope that everyone who's been involved will continue to join the conversation on social media. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.